Welcome back, Bio30 Prep. We are going to start in this lecture the respiratory system. In your textbook, it's pages 244 to 248. Short reading and the objectives for this lecture. By the end, you'll be able to identify the structures of the respiratory system, and you'll be able to describe the function of the respiratory system in general terms. The nice part about the respiratory system is, compared to the digestive system, there aren't that many parts to name. So here we have a picture of the human respiratory system. It can be divided into two sections, the upper respiratory tract and the lower respiratory tract. In the upper respiratory tract, we're really going down to about here. So this and up is all your upper. And below that point is what's considered the lower. For the upper, air is going to enter through our nose or mouth. Our nose is lined with hairs and mucus cells, or snot, for lack of a better word. We're all familiar with that stuff. So hair and mucus in our nasal passage act as a filtering system. The one nice thing about it is as air travels into our nose, it gets slowed down, and there's friction, and there's heat. And so what happens inside of our nose is air is actually warmed, mostly because of the hairs that are there. Also, that mucus is sticky stuff, and it traps particulate matter like dust and bacteria in our nose, preventing it from going down into our lungs. So it's a protective device, our nose and all that hair and mucus. It's actually a good thing. Air travels down through the pharynx, and then from the pharynx it travels through the trachea. So here we can see, here's our nasal passage and nostrils. Pharynx is really the back of your throat. If you can make it past that little flap of skin, you could actually touch the back of your throat. You'd be touching your pharynx. There's the epiglottis and glottis. The epiglottis is the flap of skin that closes. The glottis is the hole. We can see a larynx here, which is part of the upper tract, which we'll be talking about in the next couple of slides. That's your voice box. And then the trachea. The trachea goes all the way down until the branch. Once we hit the branch, we're into our lower respiratory tract. And our lower respiratory tract, air moves past the larynx into the bronchi, and the bronchi are the beginning of our lower respiratory tract. We have two of them, one here and one here. And as air moves from the bronchi into many smaller bronchioles. So what this kind of looks like is an upside down tree, is one of the ways I think about it, where your lungs almost form the branches of a tree. Air moves from the bronchioles into many small dead-end sacs called alveoli, and we'll take a look at that, at what that is in a few slides. So our nasal passage warms, moistens, cleans the air to prevent any infections or dirt getting into our lungs. The nose hairs help warm it up, and they also prevent large particles from entering our lungs. Turbinate bones project into our nasal cavity. They're tiny little bones, and what this does is it increases surface area of our nose to allow for more warming and more cleaning. The more surface we have, the more mucus can sit in our nose, and the more we can trap bacteria and dust before it gets down into our lungs. Ciliated cells in the nasal passage are lined with those hairs, and they push the dirt back up into the nasal passage. So one of the reasons our nose gets stuffy is because we're constantly secreting this mucus, but also stuff is constantly being pushed forward up towards our nose to get it out of our body. The only way things can leave is if it leaves through our nose or leaves through our mouth. The mucus traps the bacteria. Once we get past the nose, we can look at the pharynx and larynx. The pharynx is your throat. It's shared with the digestive system, so it's this tube here, right about there. This is our pharynx, and we can even go up around here a little bit. So it's shared with the digestive system. It's a tube that can transport food as well as air. It's separated from the epiglottis, or separated from the digestive system by the epiglottis. So normally, our esophagus is pretty much closed unless we're about to swallow something. As soon as we go to swallow, the food hits the back of our throat and triggers the epiglottis to close off our airway and open up our esophagus, allowing food to travel to our stomach. When we're not eating, by default, I guess you could say, our larynx is, our pharynx is open, allowing air to travel in and out of our lungs, since we breathe many times a minute, but we only eat occasionally in comparison. The larynx is your vocal cords. It's two elastic ligaments, that stretch across near the top of your trachea, and what happens is, as air passes by them, they vibrate, and that vibration creates sound. It's analogous to guitar strings. As air passes past them, or if you think about when you're playing a saxophone, the reed vibrates on a saxophone, and that's what actually makes the noise. The noise then gets shaped by our mouth and our tongue. And that's also why these two ligaments, when they get inflamed, they get bigger. And think about guitar strings. Thick guitar strings make deep, low notes. So if your larynx gets inflamed, then your voice is going to drop in terms of tone, because now they're bigger bands of tissue, bigger strings vibrating when air goes past them. If we were to look at the inside of your trachea, we'd see that it's lined with, again, mucus and ciliated cells. Here we have a picture of one from a rat. And so this is the surface, and what you can see is these globular cells surrounded by little hair-like structures. And again, this is all about trapping foreign substances before it gets deep into our lungs. The closer to our nose and mouth things get trapped, the easier it is to cough it back out and get it out of our body. Coughing is actually a response to prevent those large particles from entering the bronchi. If large particles start making it into our alveoli, they won't get back out again, and those alveoli become plugged and useless, and what's going to happen is that it reduces lung capacity. So the trachea is supported by semicircular rings of bone, so your trachea is always held open by these little rings of bone to prevent it from collapsing every time we push air out or exhale. Here's a picture of the bronchi, the bronchioles, and you can even see down here, I guess up here, this would be trachea. You can see these rings of bone that hold it open. The bronchus, or the bronchi, are also supported by rings of bone, and we have two. One goes to the right lung, one goes to the left lung. And they're basically the same structure as the trachea, they're just smaller. Each one branches into many smaller tubes, and if we take a look at this picture here, say about this point here, you'll notice that these branches here are no longer supported by any bone rings. And again, same thing here. Once you get it past about this point here, we can see that the branches aren't supported by bone. These branches are called bronchioles. And there's another picture of a bronchiole on the right side here. And they're supported by smooth muscle. So if you take a look at this picture, you can see these red bands surround the entire bronchiole. That's what determines whether or not it's going to be really open or really closed. If those muscles contract, it narrows the bronchiole. If those muscles relax, it widens the bronchiole. And that's that. All these structures are still lined with cilia and mucus, and you can even see, if you take a look at the inside of this bronchiole, it's ridged. And it's ridged to do the same thing that ridging is always doing in our body. It's to increase surface area, increase contact space between the air we're inhaling and the air and our body to maintain and remember, it's lined with cilia and mucus, and what's going to happen is the more surface area, the more opportunity to trap foreign particles and bacteria to keep them from being deep in our lungs. At the very end of every bronchiole is a set of alveoli. It looks like a clump of little, almost like a bunch of balloons at the end of a string. These are dead-end sacs that are surrounded by the capillaries. So our lungs end in dead-end sacs, and you can see each one has a bunch of blood vessels surrounding it. This is the site of gas exchange. This is where oxygen enters our body. I should watch where I'm writing, but oxygen enters blood, and CO2 exits our blood. All that oxygen is going to travel in our circulatory system to all of the cells in our body so they can do cellular respiration, so they can start breaking down sugars. That CO2 is a waste product. It's been made by all of our body cells, dumped into our blood, and then we're going to exhale it through our respiratory system. So each lung has about 150 million alveoli. Each one is only a tenth or 2/10 of a millimeter in diameter. They're quite small. They're only a single cell layer thick, and this is to allow for diffusion to happen quickly. The blood vessels, the capillaries are 1 cell thick. The alveoli are 1 cell thick, which means oxygen molecules and carbon dioxide molecules only really have to travel through a width of 2 cells, which is not a very far distance. The surface area of our lungs. So if we took those little alveoli, those 300 million alveoli, and kind of separated them all open and spread them out, we'd have something that's 40 times the size of our body lying spread out on the ground. So our lungs, those little pockets of alveoli, they're all there for surface area, increased surface area. The more surface we have, the more oxygen we can take in, the more carbon dioxide we can get rid of. They're also covered in a lipoprotein, and when we look at this word, we see lipo, that means a fat, and a protein is a protein. What it is, it's a slippery film that allows the alveoli to move freely so they don't stick together. It's a lubrication. If they weren't lubricated, then they'd stick to each other when they were inflated, and it would be harder for us to exhale air because we'd have all those alveoli sticking to each other on the outside. Our alveoli also don't deflate entirely when we exhale. When we exhale, we only exhale about 30 to 40% of our actual air volume. Those alveoli don't want to close completely because then we'd have to take a bigger breath to kind of pop them back open. If you think about a balloon, balloons when they're completely deflated are much harder to blow up than if one's already been started, right? As soon as that balloon gets started, the first couple breaths are in there, then it's easy to blow up that balloon. But before you get those first couple of breaths in there, there's too much pressure. You have to put that extra oomph into inflating them. Same idea with alveoli. They don't ever deflate completely because it would take too much effort to open them back up. If you take a look at this picture down here, this pink tissue here, this is all clusters and clusters and clusters of alveoli. So our lungs aren't just 2 big sacs, they're actually 300 million tiny little sacs. And the benefit of that is added surface area for gas exchange. That's the fancy word for moving oxygen and carbon dioxide, is gas exchange. Oxygen is coming into our body, carbon dioxide is being exhaled out. The other structure about our respiratory system we should know is pleural membrane. It's the space between our alveoli, or the space between our lungs and our rib cage. Our rib cage helps us breathe. It expands when we breathe in, and it squeezes down when we breathe out, but it's not actually up against the alveoli. There's a pleural membrane. It's a 2-layered membrane that surrounds our lungs, and its purpose is to really reduce friction, but also help us when we breathe. What we're going to find out in the next lecture when we talk about pressure, the pressure inside the pleural membrane is less than the air pressure inside of our lungs, so it actually helps our lungs inflate. But the pleural membrane, it's a double-layer membrane. The outer layer is attached to the chest cavity, so kind of along the ribs. The inner layer is attached to our lungs, and in between the 2 layers is fluid. And what that does is it just keeps the friction down when we're breathing in and breathing out. Inside of our chest cavity, we have 2 things that are moving all the time. We have our lungs and we have our heart. If we don't reduce the friction when those things are moving, then they're literally going to wear away their outside surface. If you think about car tires or bike tires, those things always need to be replaced because they're running on the road, and we need friction there to keep us sticking to the road, and it actually wears away part of the tire. Same idea with your lungs and heart. If you don't have good lubrication around them, they will wear holes in themselves. And exchanging a lung or exchanging a heart is nowhere near as easy as changing a tire. This allows lungs to expand when the chest cavity expands as well. So when our chest cavity expands, it creates space inside of our chest, which allows the alveoli to inflate. So here's a breakdown of our respiratory tract. Again, short lecture. It's really just getting the terms down, getting them in the right order. We have our upper respiratory tract, which consists of the nasal passage, the pharynx, and the trachea, and then the lower respiratory tract, which is the bronchi, the bronchioles, and the alveoli. As air passes through our respiratory tract, it comes in contact with cilia and mucus. Those things trap the destined bacteria, preventing them from entering our alveoli. We should know that the larynx is a band of elastic tissue responsible for sound generation. It's found in our trachea. The epiglottis is that thing that prevents food from entering our trachea and air from entering our stomach. That double membrane that separates our lung tissue from the surrounding rib cage is called the pleural membrane. And this is really, in terms of structures, what we need to know for our respiratory system. In the next lecture, we're going to go through the mechanics of breathing, and that will take us a little more time.